Welcome to our continuing series of studies in the book of Mark. It is Wednesday, the 29th of July, and I am glad that you're here. I hope that this study is helping you and being beneficial in your ongoing study of the Word of God, and specifically Mark's gospel account. I know it's benefiting me, the preparation for the study, and hopefully that's transitioning into your life too. We are going to try to finish up in this session our study of the section of Mark that I have called Faith and Fear, that began in chapter 4, verse 35, and will continue through the end of chapter 5. And of course, this section started with the storm on the Sea of Galilee that Jesus calmed, and we looked at that last week, and then we looked at the casting out of the legion, the demon or the multiple demons that had possessed a particular man in the Gentile region of the Gadarenes or the Gerasenes. And so we looked at that through verse 20 of chapter 5. And so today we are going to pick this up in verse 21 and continue through the end of the chapter. And this is a section where Jesus heals heals a woman and also resurrects from the dead a young 12-year-old girl. And so the interesting thing about those two miracles, and why I've combined them into one section, is because they are very connected together. The event with the little girl begins in the first part of this section in 5:21, but then that whole event is interrupted by the woman who has the flow of blood, the hemorrhage, some translations have. And so that's sometimes referred to as the parenthetical miracle, because it happens within the larger event of Jesus dealing with Jairus and his daughter. All right, so let's just transition into that and begin looking in Mark chapter 5, beginning in verse 21. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet. All right, so Jesus has left the Gentile area where he had healed the possessed man. You might remember at the end of that event, the people who had been there and witnessed this, they didn't want Jesus around anymore. They actually, out of their fear, asked him to leave their area. So he did. And this is where we pick up in verse 21. He's left that Gentile area. He's now returned to Jewish territory. And the crowds are once again coming around Jesus. And among those who came to Jesus was this man named Jairus. And he's described as one of the rulers of the synagogue. And so this man comes up to Jesus, falls down at his feet. An act of reverence, an act of submission. And I think we need to remember the significance of that and not let that escape us. As a ruler of the synagogue, Jairus was among the religious leadership. And as we've noted throughout our study of Mark thus far, the religious leadership was by and large antagonistic to Jesus. They were the ones that were challenging him at every turn. They were the ones who, at the end of chapter 3, were beginning to plot his demise. And now, obviously, that wasn't a universal thing, because you had people like Jairus who came to Jesus in faith. Mark doesn't mention Nicodemus, but John does. Nicodemus was another ruler among the Jewish people, and he came to Jesus and was sympathetic to Jesus and his mission. So while it wasn't a 100% antagonism among the Jewish leadership, it was by and large the overwhelming majority of the leadership among the Jewish people were antagonistic to Jesus. And so for Jairus to come and do what he did, to come up to Jesus publicly, Nicodemus came to Jesus privately. Jairus comes up to him publicly in front of this great crowd and bows down, falls down at the feet of Jesus. That's something that could have cost him his position as a ruler of the synagogue if the majority of these religious leaders turned against him for showing that kind of reverence to Jesus. And so this is an important thing that Jairus does. All right, and so again, back to verse 23, we pick it up. Jairus has come, he falls down at the feet of Jesus and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." Well, Jairus obviously has faith that Jesus can do something, that he can heal his little girl. And so he implores Jesus earnestly. Important words there. Implore, parakaleo, beside and to call. So literally to call beside. And it was the word that kind of grew out of that literalness of calling someone to one side, and it carried with it the idea of making a strong request, calling someone to you to make strong requests. So inherent in that word is the idea of strong request, but added to that is the word earnestly. A strong request made earnestly. That word earnestly comes from paulus, which is going to be repeated in this section. And much like megas was in the last section, paulus is another of those words that has to do with greatness, bigness. And the way it's used here as kind of an adverb, it refers to the upper range on a scale of extent, right? So if you're thinking about how, what the extent of his pleading with Jesus was, well, it's at the high end of that extent. So Jairus is begging. He's fallen at the feet of Jesus, and he is begging him with every fiber of his being, please come and save my dying daughter. And so Jesus does that. He begins to follow him. Verse 24, he went with him, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. All right, and so as Jesus begins to go with Jairus toward his home, this great crowd. Now this is not megas, this is paulus, but again it's a similar, it's essentially the same type of word, descriptive, adjective. It is a great crowd, a paulus crowd, high on the high range of crowds. It's at the upper levels of what a crowd could be. So the great crowd is following along, and they are thronged about him. Verse 24, that word throng described or defined in the lexicons as so crowded that it leaves little room for movement. Another lexicon defines it as to press in hard from all sides. So you kind of get the picture. Jesus is going with Jairus, but the crowd is so large that they're pressing in on him, even making it hard for him to move. Now again, this is characteristic. This is what Mark has been describing throughout this part of the Lord's ministry. The crowds just constantly are pressing in on him, where he can't hardly move. Earlier in our study back, I believe in chapter 3, They pressed in on him so much he couldn't even eat, couldn't even find time to have a meal. Now, again, that's the masses. The leadership, antagonistic. The masses, they want to be around him because they have seen what he's able to do as far as his miracles and such. All right, so this is what's happening. Jesus on his way to the home of Jairus to deal with and heal his dying daughter. The crowds are pressing in, but now somebody interrupts the proceedings, and it's a woman who is also in need of healing. Now, this is one of those instances of sandwiching. I don't think I used this term back in chapter 3, but I made reference to the concept. One of the things that Mark does on at least 3 occasions, maybe more than that, is he begins to tell about an event that happened in the life of Jesus. But then, before he finishes with all of that, there's another thing that happens. And then he comes back later and finishes what he began earlier. We saw that in chapter 3, where in verses 20 and 21, the family of Jesus comes to where he is, and they're seeking to pull him aside because, at least his brothers, that thought he was out of his mind. And so they come to him, but Mark doesn't finish that until the end of the chapter, the section. So from verse 21, he introduces it, but he doesn't complete it until verse 31. There's 10 verses in between there where something else happens. We'll see it again in chapter 6, and then we see it here in chapter 5, where he starts the story of Jairus, but then sandwiched in between the beginning of that story and the end of it is another story. It's something that seems to be characteristic of Mark's way of presenting things. So here's what happens as this woman approaches. Verse 25. And there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. All right. Well, I want to deal with this delicately because I think it's a delicate situation here. What this woman was dealing with. The ESV says she had a discharge of blood. That word discharge means flowing. She had a flowing of blood for 12 years. Blood was discharging or flowing out of her. Again, some translations use the word hemorrhage. I don't necessarily quarrel with that, but when I think of hemorrhage, I think of something that is that's internal only. But this was not internal only. This was blood coming out of her, flowing out, discharging from. And so what this probably was, as I understand it, was something that was a serious problem that had to do with her monthly cycle. And the problem was that it wasn't monthly. It was constant. It didn't stop. And so for 12 years, she had dealt with this issue. And she had tried everything. She had spent all of her money seeing doctors, trying to get some kind of relief, some kind of healing from this, but to no avail. The doctors, as a matter of fact, Mark says, only added to her suffering. She had suffered many things from the doctors. And the situation had not only not gotten any better, it wasn't even staying the same. It just kept getting worse over time. And so this was a bad, terrible situation for her. Now, obviously, I don't have any frame of reference to allow me to imagine what that may have been like physically. But there was even more to her situation than just this physical issue. As bad as that part of it was. There was additional problem on top of just the physical fact that she was constantly bleeding. There were also societal and religious implications to this problem. I want to call your attention to Leviticus chapter 15, and we'll look at one verse there in just a moment. But Leviticus 15 is a chapter where the law of Moses dealt with matters of bodily fluids, bodily discharges of various kinds. And one of those situations that it covered was the matter of menstruation and how women were to deal with that as it pertained to religious rites and ceremonies and stuff. In other words, how would this affect their lives and how would it affect their worship? Well, verses 19 through 24 of Leviticus 15 is the section that deals with that. And during that period of time, each month, she would be considered ceremonially unclean. And for 7 days, she would be considered unclean and not allowed to assemble for worship. We read that later in verse 31 of Leviticus 15, shows that, mentions that worship prohibition. And so during that period of time, during that period of the month, she would be considered ceremonially unclean and would have to maintain her distance. And so that was the general rule, the law under that system. Now, additionally, we find verse 25 of Leviticus 15 that says this: if a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, not at the time of her menstrual impurity, or if she has a discharge beyond the time of her impurity, which would be 7 days, she has something beyond 7 days, all the days of the discharge she shall continue in uncleanness. All right, so 7 days was the prescribed time period with regard to the law. So if that period of time was less than 7 days, she still had to complete the 7 days. But if it was over 7 days, if it lasted longer than 7 days, then she had to remain unclean until the discharge was finished. And so as long as the discharge of blood was there, she was considered unclean and could not assemble for worship. And but if you go back and read also from that chapter and that section, there were other restrictions too. She was not allowed to touch others. And anyone who touched her would be unclean also. So think about this position that this woman's in. The physical aspect of that and the continual loss of blood would have its own effects on her physically and mentally, emotionally. But also added to that was this woman was basically having to live in isolation for 12 years, unable to mingle with others, unable to assemble with them at the synagogue or the temple for worship. So this woman was in a terrible physical, emotional, spiritual, societal, religious situation, and she decides that she is going to come to where Jesus is. And so, verse 27, she had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. All right, so she's heard about Jesus, just like everybody else has. And thinking in her mind, if I can just touch his clothing, I will be made well. That was the level of her faith. Now, I don't know where she got that idea, but that was where, that was what she was thinking. And so she had a level of faith and confidence that she could go to Jesus and something good would happen if she could just touch his garment. Now, we'll notice later in the next chapter, Mark will mention that there was at least a period of time in which anyone who came to Jesus and touched his garment was made well. But that hasn't been told yet, at least as far as Mark's accounting of things is concerned. And I think we'll notice from the scenario that plays out here, not everyone that was touching Jesus was being healed on this particular occasion. So nonetheless, that's what she was thinking, and that's what motivated her to make her way through the crowd and come up behind Jesus and touch his clothing. Now think about, in the broader context here of fear and faith, think about that combination that's happening here in this particular act. She had reasons to be fearful. She had reasons to be afraid of the people in the crowd who may have known her, and no doubt a lot of them did, I'm sure. So she had reason to be afraid of them as she's mingling through the crowd. Now remember how Mark described the crowds pressing in on him. This to where it was difficult even for him to move. So you can't convince me that she wasn't touching people as she was meandering her way and pushing her way through the crowd to get to Jesus. So she had reason to fear the people who may have known her that she may have contacted in the process of pressing through the crowd. She had reason to fear the local synagogue ruler, Jairus. Remember, Jairus is still here, right? They're all walking together. Would this synagogue ruler have known who she was, her being unclean and not allowed to enter the assembly? What if she tried to sneak into the assembly? If I would suspect that he may well have known her too, just knowing that she was one who was not allowed to come in because of her 12-year uncleanness. So she had reason to fear the possibility that if Jairus sees her and he knows her, that he would tell everybody, get back, get away, don't let her up here. She had all kinds of reasons to be afraid. But whatever fears that she may have had that pulled at her to do nothing, those fears were overcome by her faith, her trust, her deep belief that Jesus could and would do something for her. And so she made her way through the crowd, touched him silently from behind. And then verse 29 tells us, and early part of verse 30, three things happened. Immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, turned about. We'll get to that in just a moment. Let's just notice the three things that happened here in 29. One, she was instantly healed. Two, she felt something physically that reassured her that she had been made well. So whatever else was going on with the continual flowing of blood, she could feel that. And once the blood stopped and was healed, she could tell just by feeling that things were now different, things were now better, things were now healed. So she was instantly healed, she felt something. And then the third thing that happened was that Jesus himself perceived that power had gone out from him. He felt something. Now, Mark doesn't tell us anything more than that. He doesn't describe the feeling, was this just a special moment, or did every time Jesus healed somebody, he felt something physically, the power going out of it? I don't know. He just tells us here, in this occasion, he did. He felt something. He felt power going out of him. And so he immediately, into verse 30, when he felt whatever it was he felt, he immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" Jesus turned about, a word that means literally to change direction. He stopped. When he felt the power go out from him, he stopped and he turned and he asked, "Who touched me?" Now, just a side point, the text doesn't say how this affected Jairus, the fact that Jesus stopped. One would suspect that it probably affected him somehow. Mark just doesn't mention it, but if you think about it, already Jesus is trying to go with Jairus to his house. The crowd is so pressed in that it's hard for them even to move. So the crowd is impeding the speed with which Jesus is able to travel. And now somebody comes up and does something that causes Jesus to stop and turn and start a conversation. I can only imagine how that might have affected Jairus' mood. But nonetheless, the disciples are perplexed at the question. And the point was, everybody's touching you. You see how the crowds are so, pressing in on you, and you want to know who touched you? Who hasn't touched you? Was kind of the mood of the disciples. And which, of course, is the indication to me that when this woman touched him, it was that this was something different. This was something special, because everybody was touching him. But only with this woman did Jesus feel something that caused him to stop and turn around, because he knew something special had happened, something different from just the masses of the people touching him. And so Jesus scans the crowd, and he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came, here's our word, in fear. She came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. All right, and so the woman comes and just spills everything. She comes in fear, she comes trembling, but she comes and she falls down before him. Now, she's not sneaking up behind him just to touch him and silently go away. She's been caught, and so she comes now in front of him and falls down before him and tells him everything. And so verse 34 says, "And he said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace, be healed of your disease.'" So Jesus commends her faith, calls her daughter. Jesus had said earlier, who's my family? Those who do the will of God, that's my family. And he calls this woman daughter. Why? Well, because she had faith. She had enough faith to overcome her fear and reach out to him. Now, her fear returned when she realized she had been discovered, because she just wanted to come up behind him, touch him, receive healing, and she was just going to go back and not be identified. But it didn't turn out that way. She was identified, but Jesus commends her faith and says, "It's your faith that made you well." Now, certainly the power of Jesus literally and immediately made her well. But his point is, if she had not had enough faith to overcome her fears, if she didn't muster enough faith to come through the crowd and risk everything that she was risking, she would have never been healed. And so in that sense and in that way, her faith is what made her well. All right. Well, now Mark picks things back up where he left them previously, while he was still speaking. In other words, at some point while Jesus was still conversing with this woman, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" Well, so someone comes with the news that Jairus' daughter had died. And with that news, they encouraged Jairus to not bother Jesus anymore. Incidentally, they call him teacher here. We pointed out throughout that Jesus was primarily known as healer, or at least that was the most important thing to the people. Here, interestingly, they refer to him as teacher. Maybe he's starting to have an influence that people are recognizing now that they need to be listening to what he says. But they say, don't bother the teacher anymore. These people who brought this news to Jairus no longer had faith that Jesus could do anything about the situation. And so they said, just don't, there's no reason to trouble him anymore. She's gone. She's dead. But Jesus speaks to Jairus and basically tells him not to listen to those that don't have faith. And that's verse 36. But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue. He doesn't speak to the ones that brought the message. He speaks to Jairus and says, do not fear, only believe. Now, Jesus had said earlier, back in chapter 4, be careful what you listen to. Remember that? In the listing of the parables, and Jesus trying to encourage the people, you need to pay attention to what I'm saying, and you need to trust in what I'm saying. Be careful who you listen to. That's his message to Jairus here. Don't fear. Don't listen to these people that are telling you, I can't do anything about this. You trust me. Don't fear, believe. So faith and fear, again, on display here. Well, Jesus then dismisses the crowds, and 37 says, he allowed no one to follow him, except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. So the mourners are there, and they arrive. There's this big commotion, and Jesus announces, much to the consternation of the people, that the girl is not dead, but sleeping. And when he had entered, he said to them, why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. So now, first of all, Jesus was neither misinformed about the girl's condition, nor was he telling an untruth. He wasn't misinformed. He knew that she was dead. When he said she's only sleeping, he wasn't lying. Jesus just did not see death the way everybody else saw death. And oftentimes the way we see death. To Jesus, this was, for him to raise her from the dead would have been no more of a problem to him than it would for anybody else to wake somebody up from a literal sleep. And death is described in Scripture as sleep, the sleep of the body. Daniel 12:2, one example of that. That which sleeps in the dust of the earth. Well, what is that? What's the body? And Jesus would refer to that the same way with Lazarus. John chapter 11, verse 11. Lazarus is asleep and we must go and wake him. And the disciples, what do you mean by that? If he's asleep, he's fine. And Jesus said, no, look, Lazarus is dead. All right, so that's just, Jesus just viewed death differently than most everybody else. The people who came and gave the news to Jairus, to them, this is over. She's gone. There's nothing that can be done. But to Jesus, it was different. And so he takes the mother and father into the room. He takes those who were with him. That's probably Peter, James, and John. They go into the room, and Jesus raises her from the dead. 41 and 42. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha Kumi. It's an Aramaic phrase which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. and they were immediately overcome with amazement. I don't know if there's any significance necessarily to the 12 years. 12 years the woman had her physical problem. 12 years for the entire life of this girl, that woman had the blood flow problem, and this girl 12 years old. So Jesus raises her from the dead. She arises immediately, and then verse 43 ends the chapter with these words: "And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat." It's kind of an interesting thing. Jesus, again, concerned about the girl, and says, "Hey, she's probably hungry. She's been sick, obviously, and died and all that. She's probably hungry. Give her something to eat." But the first part of that, again, we find Jesus telling them, "Don't tell anybody about this." Now, we talked about this last time. When Jesus was in a Gentile area, he told the guy, "You go tell everybody." But when he's in the Jewish area, he says, "Don't tell anybody." The news about Jesus was already out there, and the crowds always around him. But Jesus was trying to control that as much as he could. If you'll allow me to use this new terminology that's come into our vernacular over recent months, Jesus was trying to flatten the curve of information that was out there about him, that's being spread around. And so he says, don't tell people about this. And there ends the chapter. Now, I want us to consider some lessons from this that we can use by way of practical application, and then we'll be through for this session. One of the themes that runs through Mark chapter 5 is people falling down at the feet of Jesus. And we find it in verse 6. The demon that we looked at in our last session fell down before him. In verse 22, Jairus falls down at his feet. Verse 33, the woman comes and falls down before him. It's interesting that happens on those three occasions in Mark chapter 5. But by way of application, consider the things that they found at the feet of Jesus. The demon-possessed man found emotional stability. Spending time at the feet of Jesus can calm the restlessness of your soul. Now, I know obviously the man possessed was dealing with a different situation, but still, he was found, verse 15, after his encounter with Jesus, in his right mind. Living life at the feet of Jesus can bring that kind of stability to your mind and your soul. How about the woman who had the discharge of blood? She found at the feet of Jesus peace and acceptance. Jesus said, "Go in peace." He accepted her. She could bear her soul before Jesus and jettison her fears. Though she came to him in fear, he said to her, "You can have peace. You can go in peace. There's no need to be afraid anymore." Jesus offers a burden that is light, Matthew 11:28 to 30. And then Jairus at the feet of Jesus found a blessing for his daughter. That's all he wanted. He wasn't unlike the rest of us, only wanting something good for his child. And he knew where to turn and was willing to turn there regardless of what it might cost him. And parents, we need to bring our children to the feet of Jesus and find the guidance there that they need. Ephesians 6, verse 4. All right, so at the feet of Jesus, something by way of application. Now, we had talked about faith and fear, right? And I want to come back to that because in these miraculous events that began in end of chapter 4 and continuing through chapter 5, you have faith and fear on display. And so we find these lessons. The woman's faith overcame whatever fears that she may have had of contaminating people in the crowd, including Jesus, or being turned away from Jesus by Jairus or whoever, the people. She had a lot of fears that could have kept her from coming to Jesus, but her faith overcame those fears. Jairus, He had to look past the advice of his friends, who said once the daughter had died, they said, look, don't bother him anymore. Well, he had to look past that. And he had to look past the cynicism of the mourners when Jesus said she's only sleeping, and they're laughing him to scorn. Jairus still had to generate the faith in Jesus to go in with him and see what he could do. And he did that. So he overcame potential fears. And that leads us then to the question that we'll end with for us is, how are we going to respond to Jesus? Will we let fear keep us from coming to him and being blessed by him? Or will we approach him in faith? Will we turn aside from whatever we're afraid of that may be keeping us from coming to Jesus? Will we set aside those fears? Will we let our faith overcome those fears so that we can come into the presence of Jesus and fall at his feet and be blessed by him? Well, that's the question that we have, and that's the question that Mark is giving to his readers at this point. Who is this Jesus? And as you're learning who he is and seeing all the things that he's doing, seeing all these miracles that he's performing, seeing his power and all of that, will you let your faith in everything that those miracles are teaching you, will you allow your faith to press to push you beyond your fears of following him, as these people did? And look at the blessing that they received when they allowed their faith to conquer their fears. Okay, so Mark is moving the reader in that direction. He's moving us in that direction. And so that's the question we need to consider. How will we respond to Jesus, in fear or in faith? Let's pray. Father, thank you for this time of study that we've had. Thank you for the examples in Mark chapters 4 and 5 of faith. We thank you for showing us that faith can overcome fear and that there's great blessing to be had in living a life of faith as opposed to a life of fear. And we pray that as we look deep within ourselves, that if we find fears that are keeping us from following Jesus completely and fully, that we would strengthen our faith, and that our faith could overcome those things that cause us fear. Through Jesus we pray. Amen. All right, my friends, thanks for watching the video, and hope you guys have a good rest of the week. We will do this again soon. Love you.